Well, there was a large number of recommendations that were made by the report, but what was particularly interesting is that the Inspector General wasn't leaving any of these recommendations just up to the FBI.
Okay.
What he noted was that he was initiating effectively a whole nother review that was going to emanate out of the Office of Inspector General, that was going to be looking at all the compliance issues and the people involved from top to bottom in both the Woods procedures and the FISA application process, and announced that literally today we are opening a brand new audit into this process. So what the IG is saying is, rather than kind of giving the FBI a list of recommendations of here are errors that we found and here are errors that we think you should address, the IG is telling the FBI, we don't trust you to make these. We're going to be the ones that are going to oversee all the different alterations and changes that you're making. And oh, by the way, if we don't like them, we're going to note them. You know, we're looking, the devil's in the details. We're going to make sure that not only do you comply with us, with our recommendations, but that we agree with the way in which that you're complying with our recommendations.
Amidst the media spin about the recent Department of Justice IG report, what is the real bottom line? What does it mean for the FBI and its future? Did Inspector General Horowitz really find that there was no bias in the opening of the Russia probe? And, doing a deep dive into the Horowitz report and Horowitz's testimony in the Senate hearing that followed, what's the most important information that was revealed? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jekielek. In this episode, we'll sit down with Epoch Times columnist Jeff Carlson, a key contributor to the Epoch Times who was instrumental in our coverage of the Spygate scandal and in the creation of the Epoch Times iconic Spygate poster. He is a CFA Charterholder who worked for 20 years as an analyst and portfolio manager in the high-yield bond market. Jeff Carlson, excellent to have you on American Thought Leaders.
I am very happy to be here with you, Jan. Thanks for having me.
So Jeff, you know, this has been a long time coming. We've been discussing when to do some deep dives into all this work that the Epoch Times and you and Jasper and many other folks have been doing with respect to Spygate and related matters, let's say, okay? The IG report just came out recently. Of course, you know, you've been publishing prolifically already around this, tweets, articles. Why don't you give us your overall impression of the report to start?
My overall impression of the report is that it ended up being a condemnation of a lot of the FBI's activities.
Okay.
And in particular, their approach to the entire FISA process. And it provided a condemnation of the Steele dossier, effectively proving that the dossier was uncorroborated, that despite that uncorroboration, the dossier was the primary component. It was the element that allowed the FBI to get a FISA on Carter Page, that without it, they could not have done it. And in the same vein, the IG report systematically destructed most of what was in the Steele dossier.
Right.
And you know, that runs significantly against the narrative that the mainstream media has been trying to promote. And Horowitz continued that in his testimony. During his testimony, he was very emphatic about the numerous flaws that were contained within the Steele dossier and within the FISA application process.
So Jeff, there's so much that you mentioned there, and you know, we're gonna do the deep dive here. Because I know you've been thinking very, very deeply about all these things all along. But before we start that, you know, you were pretty central in creating this Spygate infographic, which then turned into a poster, which has been very popular among our readership and viewership. With the Jasper, you guys worked on this together. Given what we learned from the IG report, how does that relate to the Spygate? The Spygate infographic?
I think the IG's report really helped to show that infographic has held up very well over time. The only caveat that I would have with that is that the infographic actually expands beyond Horowitz's investigation. IG Horowitz was specifically limited to individuals within the Department of Justice. But there are many other participants in all of this, other agencies such as the CIA, headed by John Brennan at the time, James Clapper, Director of National Intelligence.
Right.
Then we have the outside intelligence agencies coming from the UK, from Australia, Italy involved. There's probably a few others that have yet to be named. So those weren't fully, they were perhaps touched on very briefly in the IG report, but not a lot of information there. But as far as the IG report, what was in the IG report and its validation of what we reported and what's in that infographic, we feel that it validated everything that's in there.
One of the things that I've seen repeated again and again, both in media headlines and on Twitter and so forth, is that Horowitz found there was no bias in the opening of the investigation and of the Russia probe. What do you say to that?
Well, Horowitz found that the FBI they had the proper predicate to open their counterintelligence investigation on July 31st, 2016. But he continued and noted that effectively the rules and regulations surrounding the FBI's ability to open an investigation such as that were so lax that effectively it would be very difficult to find any fault with it whatsoever. And he specifically noted in his report that it was those very lax oversight procedures and methodologies of the FBI that he intended to address. So while he acknowledged that the FBI had proper predicate to open the investigation, he equally found fault with the ability that the FBI had such latitude that they could do so. So there's been a lot of mischaracterization of one part of his statement without acknowledging the problems that he found that the FBI was, for lack of a better term, almost operating completely independent of any oversight. He specifically noted that they were not required, nor did they go to department officials, and by department I mean the DOJ,
right,
in the opening of that investigation. They just did what they wanted to do.
So one of the things I saw in Horowitz's testimony now, he was specifically asked about, I think, whether he's ruling out any possibility of bias, and he actually spoke quite clearly to that, right?
That's correct. Horowitz said, he was asked specifically, did he find bias in relation to the FISA process? And he answered that he most clearly did. What he did say is there was something to the effect that he didn't find political bias in terms of opening the investigation.
Okay.
And people have taken that and then said that Horowitz found that there was no bias whatsoever. But during his testimony, he very clearly said that he found bias as it relates to the FISA process. And he listed a large litany of problems and procedures, and frankly, a large number of items that were intentionally hidden from the FISA court by the FBI that backs up his assertion.
So we'll actually play the clip of him saying that, because I think that's actually quite important.
If someone were to characterize what you are telling us to be that you're telling us there is no bias here, that's not what you're telling us.
That is not as to the operation of these files is what I'm telling you.
So another thing that Horowitz said, which you made me think of in what you were saying a little bit earlier, was that Horowitz actually doesn't have the ability to oversee the DOJ attorneys. And that's astounding to me, an astounding thing to learn. How does that work?
Well, this is actually a battle that Horowitz has been fighting for a number of years. There was a period of time where he didn't have oversight over entire operations that were going on with the DOJ, such as the issuance of national security letters, which are akin to a loose FISA that the FBI can get.
Okay.
And he ultimately won that battle right at the time that Obama left office.
Okay.
But one of the things that he cannot do is provide oversight for attorneys. He still is yet to get that back. And if you think about the implications of that, it's quite shocking because we're talking about the Department of Justice.
It's mostly attorneys, or at least there's a heck of a lot of attorneys.
The FBI is a subcomponent of the DOJ, and so he has oversight of those. But as you said, the Department of Justice, by its very definition, is primarily comprised of attorneys, and yet he doesn't have oversight over those individuals. And he is the only IG out of all of the many, many IGs that exist to look at our various governmental agencies that does not have that power.
And so what are the implications of that for the IG report?
Well, consider the limitations. In terms of, you carve out a large number of people that he is even able to go ahead and interview and compelled to be interviewed,
right,
and have direct oversight of their actual actions. I certainly hope that this is something that gets addressed moving forward. It should never have been in place in the first matter.
Okay, Jeff, so let's dive into the key findings of the report. I think when we were talking offline earlier, you identified 25 items that made you raise your eyebrows. Wow, there's something here. I don't know if we can cover every single one of those, but what were some of the most important ones to you? Why don't we start there?
Well, first of all, he identified 7 errors that were made in the initial Carter Page FISA application.
Right.
Further, he identified another 10 major items that were made in the 3 subsequent renewals of the Carter Page FISA application.
Right.
He also discovered significant, although he didn't provide a number, but a significant number of error in the Woods procedures,
okay,
which is effectively the documentation that is submitted that is backing up the assertions that are being made in a FISA application.
Okay.
And he found a number of issues that pertain directly to Steele himself.
Okay.
Christopher Steele, created his dossier, and there's the sense that Steele had this large network of people that he was getting information from, and the reality couldn't be further from the truth. Chris Steele had one source of information who is known as the primary subsource in the Inspector General's report. And this primary subsource then had his own network of people that he was getting information from, that he was the sole conduit relaying that information to Steele.
Right.
So there's multiple implications to be made from this. First of all, Steele is getting information second, third, potentially fourth or fifth hand for all we know. But the other issue was the FBI did not even bother to interview the primary subsource, the person who is providing all of the information supposedly within the Steele dossier, until January 2017. Now that's after the first initial application of the Carter Page FISA in October 21st. And it's days after they just submitted their first renewal of the Carter Page FISA. When they met with this primary subsource, the primary subsource for the first time had seen what Christopher Steele had written because BuzzFeed had just released the Steele dossier. Now, what the primary subsource then told the FBI was, I don't recognize a lot of information that's being contained in here. This is not what I told Steele. Steele exaggerated what I told him. He fabricated some of what I told him. Effectively, the primary subsource was saying that the information contained in the Steele dossier was not the information that he had given to Steele. Now, as bad as that is, the FBI did nothing with this information, bearing in mind that literally days before they had gone again to the FISA court for a renewal, the FBI not only failed to go back to the FISA court with this very material information, which effectively invalidates the dossier, they failed to tell the FISA court of that in the following renewals that they made for the Carter Page FISA.
It's just kind of mind-boggling that this could happen. This is this exculpatory evidence, part of it that was kind of withheld.
That's not all of the exculpatory evidence, but that is definitely part of it. There's various other exculpatory elements that were excluded, and some of this happened earlier on, like when Papadopoulos was first examined back in the spring of 2016, and when Carter Page was first met up with Halper at the conference in July, and then his subsequent meetings with Stefan Halper, who was an FBI informant for people who are unaware of that name. And universally, the responses that were given, that Halper recorded from Papadopoulos, from Page, were all exculpatory. They were denials. So there would be leading questions like, aren't you trying to get information from the Russians on Hillary?
Right.
And the answer would be, no, we are not trying to do that. None of that information was given to the FISA court. And rather than the FBI, which literally only got exculpatory information back from these variant surveillance methods early on, rather than them thinking that, well, maybe, there isn't something here, they never chose to talk to these people directly early on. They just kept looking for more and for more and for more information. And they found it with the Steele dossier, which culminated, of course, in the Carter Page FISA application.
Right. So one thing I wanted to clarify, because I know there's a lot of confusion about this. I've seen this just looking on Twitter and some discussions I've had with people. There were 4 FISAs, but it was basically the initial Carter Page FISA and then 3 renewals. But there were no FISAs, at least to the Inspector General's knowledge, around for any of the other characters that it was suspected that there might be FISAs on. Is that?
You touch on 2 elements. The first one regarding who was actually subjected to a FISA warrant, you're correct. It turned out it was only Carter Page. There had been a lot of speculation that George Papadopoulos, Mike Flynn, and Paul Manafort were also all subject to FISAs. The Inspector General noted that he was unable to find any evidence that either Flynn, Manafort, or Papadopoulos were subjected to a FISA. George Papadopoulos had repeatedly claimed he was subject to one, but at least as far as the Inspector General was able to find, that was not the case.
Right.
It was only on Carter Page. But there's another fascinating element to this, and that is that the FBI did attempt to get a FISA on Carter Page in August. And they went to the FISA court with all the information that they had on Page.
So this is ahead of when they actually ended up getting it.
Ahead of the October
They made an
actual,
attempt early on.
They made a prior attempt, correct.
Right.
And when they went there, they were told by 2 separate parties, the Office of Intelligence, which is the DOJ division, apparently also the FISA court as well, but they were told that your information that you're bringing us does not meet the threshold, does not meet the standard of obtaining a FISA warrant, and it does not determine that Carter Page was an agent of a foreign power, which is a pretty serious designation and accusation to make.
Right.
So they were turned down. Now, that is when the FBI then turned their sights to Christopher Steele. They were already aware of Christopher Steele and his dossier. I believe Andrew McCabe, he was apprised of everything that Steele had at the beginning of August.
Okay.
But it was at that point that they then went to Rome and met up with Steele, along with Steele's FBI handler, got all the dossier documents, 3 of which I might add Steele wrote a day before they came out there.
Okay.
So he was effectively trying to provide them with as much information as he possibly could. The FBI came back with that, and that was the predicate for getting the FISA on Page.
So, for the record, the Steele dossier, and we already talked about this a little bit earlier, was absolutely, definitely central to getting that initial FISA.
The Steele dossier was the reason that they were able to get the dossier. They had already been turned down based on the information they had in their possession, the Steele dossier. Mm-hmm. The Steele dossier, what was allowed them to get the FISA. Now, at one point, Andrew McCabe admitted this in the House memo. He said that he didn't think that we would have been able to get the FISA without the Steele dossier.
Right.
Sally Moyer, an attorney within the DOJ office, called it 50-50, and I take some issue with that because based on what the Inspector General said, without the Steele dossier, it would have been impossible for them to get the FISA on Carter Page.
Well, let's talk about Carter Page a little bit here, because, I think Carter Page was already, I guess, declaring his innocence of all of this years ago, right? He's had information, he's been saying things that mostly have turned out to be pretty accurate all the way along, right?
Absolutely. Carter Page went so far as sending a letter to FBI Director Comey, laying out his position and offering to come in to meet with the FBI right then and there, yet they chose to defer any interview of him. And what's really interesting about this is Carter Page had a history with another agency whereby he was assisting in a case that involved Evgeny Buryakov, who was a Russian spy.
Okay.
And Carter Page actually assisted the government in the case against Buryakov, who was ultimately convicted. He's now been deported. And that is one of the major components that the Inspector General found. There was information readily available that Carter Page had been working for another agency and assisting the U.S. government
Right.
in a case against a Russian national.
Right.
Now, right there on the face of it, that information makes it kind of difficult to think of somebody conceptually as an agent of a foreign power. The FBI did not submit that information to the FISA court. And as a matter of fact, that whole issue becomes even worse based on some actions that the Inspector General found regarding an attorney by the name of Kevin Kleinsmith.
Okay, right. So Kevin Kleinsmith, for everybody, he's the one who's basically said that he altered an email that was then used also in the FISA process.
Correct.
Can you explain what happened?
Kleinsmith is noted as the OGC counsel in within the IG report. And Kleinsmith had been informed that there was information that Carter Page had already worked for another governmental agency. And he was asked to go ahead and look into that and verify that that was indeed correct. And the assumption from the person who asked him to do this was, I'm virtually certain Page had worked for another agency. I want you to verify that. If so, we really got to be telling the FISA court this, because it alters the landscape. Now, what Kleinsmith did was he found the evidence that indeed Page had worked for another agency, but he changed the email that was sent to him and inserted the words that Page was, quote unquote, not a source, end quote, for the other agency. And that information was then given to the FISA court, and that was it really was a critical matter.
Right.
Because it enabled the FISA court to accept a lot of the other findings and then make the determination that, yes, we agree with you, Carter Page was an agent of a foreign country, which allowed for the whole entire FISA to proceed. So this was a material alteration. It might not be too much of a stretch to say that if that hadn't occurred, there might never have been able to even be a FISA on Carter Page.
Well, and Kleinsmith, from what I understand, he's been portrayed in these, weeks ago there were these leaks, talking about one of the things we might expect to see in the Horowitz report. But Kleinsmith wasn't he actually the head of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation at one point?
Yeah, Kleinsmith has been consistently portrayed as a low-level attorney within the FBI. And the reason for this was because that was the information that leaked pre the IG report,
okay,
that there had been an email alteration by an attorney. So, the narrative that began was, it was one low-level attorney who didn't really matter to the process, who altered something in an email. And the major problems with that are, first of all, what Kleinsmith altered was hugely material. And two, as you properly note, Kleinsmith was, and this is according to the Inspector General report, the lead attorney on the FBI's counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign beginning in early 2017, somewhere around the time frame of January. So this was not a low-level attorney. This was somebody who was near the very top of the process.
So it really seems like Carter Page has been horrendously treated by the FBI here.
Carter Page has got to be one of the individuals who's been the most mistreated of all. To be portrayed as an agent of a foreign power, to ignore all the evidence that he had been attempting to put forth throughout this, to have his name, kind of effectively dragged through the mud. When you couple that with the fact that here was the same guy that had been assisting the government, the U.S. government, in cases against active Russian spies. I think another one that would fall into that would be General Michael Flynn. And personally, I'm very happy to see that he has a new attorney in Sidney Powell, and we're seeing that case is aggressively being addressed as well. But, Carter Page did everything under his power to try to clear his name. He was upfront, he went on TV, he spoke openly, he wrote to FBI Director Comey, and the FBI effectively tried to ignore that for as long as they could. And they quite literally refused to include exculpatory evidence, which is the same thing that they did with Papadopoulos. None of Papadopoulos' statements that were made denying that he had, anything to do with what was being inferred upon him were included as well.
So there's a lot of information about Carter Page and essentially exonerating him, very thoroughly. What about General Flynn?
On General Flynn, that case is still very much developing. It seems like there's a lot of information that was not presented to the court that should have been presented to the court. Sidney Powell is, again, his new attorney, and is now aggressively pursuing that matter and trying to get new information to the court. I would personally love to see Michael Flynn fully exonerated from everything for this. I mean, he served our country for decades as a wonderful patriot, and nothing would make me happier than seeing him receive full exoneration. I've not read the entirety of the 460-page report.
Okay.
What I've done is I've used keywords to highlight my way through it, looking for different events, people, etc.
Yeah.
I have found very, very little on Flynn. Mm-hmm. One of the only things that I did find on Flynn was the fact that a FISA was not actually issued on him.
Right.
Now, I suspect that that's for a couple reasons. One, that Flynn is not a DOJ employee. And at the time that some of this was going on, he was National Security Advisor for the Trump campaign. So it may well be that Flynn sort of falls largely out of the purview of Horowitz, while at the same time, there's very much an active case ongoing with Flynn between the government and Flynn and his new attorneys.
Right.
So, there may be some real reasons why Horowitz has sort of shied away from that.
Okay. So a major narrative that was basically kind of blown apart here was this sort of the Steele dossier not being important. That was one major narrative that was blown apart through the IG report. What are other narratives that come to mind? Well,
just continuing in that same vein, another one that was blown apart was Steele's credibility itself. There was a large amount of information about Steele's work that was either misrepresented or not presented to the FISA court. One of the assertions was made was that Steele's work had been used in prior criminal cases.
Okay.
Well, it turns out that's 100% false. And there's documentary evidence that the FBI knew that when they speculated on that. And I believe that was the IG's words. They speculated that his information had been used in prior criminal cases. And it was very easy to find out that that was indeed not the case. As a matter of fact, some members of the FBI actively knew that. Another was information on Steele's background and Steele's work. When I believe it was the VMU in office when the FBI, they sent officials abroad to talk to people who knew Steele and knew his past work. And the information that came back was somewhat mixed but far from flattering. A lot of the information indicated that Steele tended to be, and this is going to be my word, not a direct quote, but that his work was sloppy, it was unreliable, and that he had a tendency to exaggerate. It was the kind of information that, people within the FBI relying on that individual almost solely for their application of a FISA. At an absolute bare minimum, that information should have been translated to the FISA court. Realistically, they probably, based on that information, should have just halted that process and continued to do a much greater examination of what Steele had actually done. Steele also, interestingly, made it very apparent to the FBI that his allegiance was first and foremost to Fusion GPS. He was already a paid client of Fusion at that time.
Okay.
And quite literally told the FBI during their first meeting that that was where his allegiance lay, and that was going to be his primary concern, but that he was willing to share information with the FBI. And, you know, again, that type of information was not given to the FISA court.
Again, when you put it this way, it's almost unfathomable how something like this could be possible. It actually reminds me of a quote.
We found, and as we outline here, are deeply concerned that so many basic and fundamental errors were made by 3 separate handpicked investigative teams on one of the most sensitive FBI investigations after the matter had been briefed to the highest levels within the FBI, even though the information sought through the use of FISA authority related so closely to an ongoing presidential campaign, and even though those involved with the investigation knew that their actions would likely be subjected to close scrutiny. The circumstances reflect a failure, as we outline in the report, not just by those who prepared the applications, but also by the managers and supervisors in the Crossfire Hurricane chain of command, including FBI senior officials who were briefed as the investigation progressed.
That is indeed a damning statement. And, you know, note that he mentions that there was 3 separate teams. It wasn't as if one element, over to the side had made systematic errors, but rather that these errors were made across all the different segments of the investigation at both low levels and working there all the way up through the chain of command to the highest levels of oversight within the FBI. And, you know, the cynic within me, when he notes that they were going to be subject to, that they made these errors despite being aware that they could be subject to review, the cynic in me wonders, were they really concerned about that, given that there was a preponderance of thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency?
So this really makes me think of Horowitz's testimony to the Senate, because it kind of clarified a number of the questions that were, I guess, on people's minds from reading the report itself.
You know, I think as Horowitz's testimony progressed, I think that people became more and more alarmed. You know, the IG report had only been out 2 days. People had limited time to read that. And as Horowitz was detailing all of these serious breaches of, what I see as duty,
okay,
I think the alarm level continued to increase. And that, these senators and representatives began to see that this was not something that was limited to one small segment within the FBI, but rather that this permeated the entirety of the investigative structure, really from the bottom all the way to the top. And, had them questioning, asking Horowitz the question, like, how can anybody explain that there was this many errors from this many different areas within the FBI, that it seems inexplicable? And Horowitz had what I viewed as a very damning answer to that question.
Okay. I believe you're talking about his response to Senator Crapo.
That's correct.
Right? Yeah.
But it seems to me that if we go beyond the bias question to intentional versus grossly negligent, it seems to me that the kind of misconduct that has been presented by you and reviewed by our chairman and many others here today is mind-numbing to consider that it could be just accidental. Mm-hmm. Can you reach a conclusion like that?
I'd be skeptical, but I understand why people would be skeptical of that. There is such a range of conduct here that is inexplicable, and the answers we got were not satisfactory, that we're left trying to understand how could all these errors have occurred over a 9-month period or so among 3 teams, handpicked, one of the highest profile, if not the highest profile case in the FBI, going to the very top of the organization involving a presidential campaign.
There's a lot in here, right?
That is a broad and damning statement made by the Inspector General. He's finding errors effectively throughout the organization, and of a totality that it, from my point of view, looks intentional, and from his point of view, he is certainly indicating that although he was searching for answers, for people to help me understand, provide me explanations as to why you did all the various things that you did, he did not get those answers. And he was unable to find an explanation for the 3 different teams that were doing the various investigations. There's a lot of unanswered questions that remain as a result of this report.
Well, so that kind of leads us, I guess, to Barr and Durham here, because both the Attorney General and Durham, they issued statements, very rapidly after the report came out, and it seems like, I guess it's their work or Durham's work which is going to pick up here.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that I think is worth noting about this is, personally, I viewed the Inspector General's report as going further and providing more of a condemnation than I think what a lot of people had been expecting.
Okay.
So in the context of that, you now have Barr and Durham, who have the ability to look at a whole number of areas that are outside the scope of the DOJ Inspector General's ability.
Okay.
And they're coming out with statements saying, hey, we disagree with a couple of your conclusions, specifically the one that the FBI was able to go ahead and open in the investigation. Barr was a little bit more kind of politically careful in his statement. It was fairly nicely phrased, although he made it clear that he did disagree, with the IG's finding about the FBI's ability to open the investigation.
Right.
He also highlighted the fact that they effectively falsified the FISAs to the FISA court, lied to the FISA court. But Durham's statement was even stronger, albeit a shorter statement.
Okay.
And he noted specifically, that he has the inherent ability, this is U.S. Attorney John Durham,
Right.
The one that was appointed by Barr to continue this investigation, that he has the ability to look at a much greater and deeper scope than what Horowitz does. Not only is he limited to the DOJ, Durham can go look at other governmental agencies like the CIA, any governmental agency,
Right.
And he can look both domestically and he can look overseas.
And has been.
And he has been.
Right.
It's very worth noting, as you mentioned, it's worth noting that both Barr and Durham took 2 separate trips to Italy, one in August and one in late September 2016, to visit with Italian intelligence officials. In addition, Barr has stated that he has talked with intelligence officials from the UK, Britain, from Australia, and again, of course, Italy. He kind of hinted there may have been some others that he's also conversing with. So it's very clear that the Durham investigation is much, much broader than the scope of the Inspector General's investigation. And let's not forget that although it's easy to think of the Inspector General as looking at the entirety of what went on in the 2016 election, both pre and post,
Right.
the actual investigation that he was supposed to be focusing on and primarily did was on FISA abuse.
Yes.
Now that is a much more limited scope. There's many other things. He doesn't really touch on the CIA for that matter. But again, he was focusing on the aspects of FISA abuse.
Right.
Durham is looking at the entirety of events. And in my assumption, that probably means moving at least back into 2015 when Glenn Simpson's firm was hired to do political research against Donald Trump and employed Nellie Orr, who just so happens by some miracle to be the wife of the DOJ
Yes.
official Bruce Orr, who was mentioned prominently in Horowitz's report. Go ahead.
You just reminded me, there's this one in the testimony, there was this one moment where I forget who's doing the questioning, but there's just a fundamental question. What is Bruce Orr doing being involved in Crossfire Hurricane? Right?
It was Ben Sass,
Right.
and he asked the question. The topic of Bruce Orr had come up, and the fact that, here's another thing. Bruce Orr was downplayed as a very low-level DOJ official, which is not the truth. He was the highest career ranking official within the DOJ. He was responsible for the Drug Enforcement Task Force. He had multiple titles within the DOJ. He's a very, very important, prominent figure.
Okay.
But he had no business at all being involved in the counterintelligence investigation. That was entirely outside of his purview. And the FBI utilized Orr as an ongoing liaison with Christopher Steele.
Right. After they had fired him, basically, right?
After they had fired Chris Steele for cause, or had been in communication prior to that with Steele, but he became the official liaison between Steele and the FBI after the FBI fired Christopher Steele. And this was to the point that Orr was actually given an official FBI handler. So it wasn't as if the FBI told Bruce Orr, hey, if you happen to hear some information from Chris Steele, come and, just fill us in on that. No, there was a direct liaison that Bruce Orr reported to. Now, what Bruce Orr didn't know is that while he was giving this information to his handler, this information was being transcribed in 302s, which are effectively handwritten notes of the discussion or interview.
Yes.
But then that handler was turning around and giving all of that information to Peter Strzok for use in the Trump counterintelligence investigation. So really, kind of a shocking use. And Ben Sass's question was, I believe he said something to the effect of, what the hell was Bruce Orr doing involved in this investigation?
Right.
And the Inspector General responded, effectively, we have no idea why he had any involvement in this process. He should not have been involved in any way, shape, or form. One other thing real quickly it's worth noting is that Bruce Orr failed to inform his superiors, of which there's only a couple given how high-ranking he was, of what he was doing with the FBI. He kept that information hidden completely from his direct line superiors.
You just reminded me of this question that Senator Lindsey Graham asked about the use of defensive briefings then as effectively opportunities to gather intelligence and write up as three. I mean, this was a kind of a mind job for me. Can you speak to this a bit or expand on it?
I'm glad you brought this up because this is a pretty big deal.
Okay.
The FBI provided, I'm just going to back up a little bit on this, but the FBI provided defensive briefings to the Trump campaign. What they weren't telling the Trump campaign is that the FBI viewed these defensive briefings as something entirely different. When they met with the members of the Trump campaign, it was effectively as part of their actual investigation rather than to give them a defensive briefing. And the FBI took 302s of everybody that they talked to during the defensive briefing with the Trump campaign, and then went back and took those 302s and used that information as part of their counterintelligence investigation against the Trump campaign. So, I mean, really stop and think about the implications of that. You're the Trump campaign. You think you've got the FBI coming to warn you, quote unquote, about possible intrusions into the campaign or, certain concerns about foreign entities.
Yes.
And what the FBI is really doing is they're trying to surveil you, which literally is exactly what they did. And it is this matter that Lindsey Graham was referring to when he was questioning IG Horowitz. And he made kind of an off-the-cuff reference saying, well, tomorrow when we have our meeting with you in the Senate, do I need to be worried about the FBI using these 302s as part of a further investigation? The answer by Horowitz was extremely surprising. It was something along the lines of, yes, this is something we are extremely concerned about.
Okay, so when we get defensively briefed tomorrow, would it be okay for FBI agents to open up 302s on what we said?
We have very significant concerns about that, and I would note that in Director Wray's response, he underlined that would not occur going forward.
Again, sort of mind-blowing revelations in this report.
There really are so many, which is why I said I feel that this report is a lot stronger than maybe what people had anticipated, or perhaps have yet to fully appreciate. And again, this is a narrow scope. This is the IG looking at FISA abuse, albeit with some spillover into certain other areas. But, this is nothing compared to the scope that John Durham is actually looking at.
Another thing that, kind of blows my mind, and this goes back to the media portrayal. I mean, there's been portrayals, I don't know if, I'm not sure in the media, but certainly there's been very prominent figures on Twitter that were describing the report as exonerating the FBI. And I was like, even the basic cursory sense I had of it, I was just kind of, how can you possibly say that given the little bit that I already know? But here it's almost like this is, very firm groundwork for Durham to be doing his work. Or something, as in stark contrast to this exoneration or something like that.
The problem is the media's role in this has been so great. In my Spygate piece, I referred to them as complicit, and that they've been carrying this narrative for so long. And as new facts come to light, they're sometimes forced to alter their narrative a little bit, but they continue to pursue down that path. And there's this tendency to cherry pick. So when IG Horowitz said that, it was okay, I couldn't find any reason why the FBI couldn't open their investigation because there's no regulations and the FBI can do whatever the heck it wants. The mainstream media took the one small portion that that he didn't find any fault with the FBI opening their investigation.
And that was the big headline.
And excluded everything else. Mm-hmm. And again, it sounds like Durham and Barr have found evidence that actually even contradict that finding. That remains to be seen. But it's been this ongoing narrative that I feel that the mainstream media is so committed to that many of them, they just simply cannot bring themselves to admit that they were, for the last 3 years, that they were wrong, and in some cases outright lying, to the American public.
Right.
That they're locked into this. I think the smart ones have had a tendency to maybe get a little more quiet recently, and we'll see how long that holds up. But I can't say it strongly enough, is that this report destroyed the Steele dossier. Absolutely destroyed it, and it destroyed Christopher Steele's credibility was destroyed with it.
Any big surprises that you found in here, aside from perhaps how strong it was? It sounds like that was surprising to you, but any surprises that come to mind?
Well, gosh, there's so many, but just offhand, I'll think of two. One, I, like many other people, thought that there had probably been multiple FISAs.
Okay.
And it had been reported that there was a FISA on Manafort that then was lifted while he was the campaign manager for Trump.
Okay.
And then before he left. I thought the odds were pretty good that there was going to be a FISA at some point on Papadopoulos and or General Flynn. So, the Inspector General said that he was unable to find any evidence. So I found that to be a little bit surprising. Another element that I found surprising was a very oblique role to the CIA's, an oblique reference to the CIA's role in all this.
Okay.
And that is, the Inspector General noted that the Steele's dossier, as fabricated and as falsified and as poorly done as it was used in the intelligence community assessment.
Right.
Which was produced by Brennan and Clapper. For a long time, the mainstream media tried to throw out this nonsense that it was 17 agencies. That's utterly false. It was 3 agencies, one of whom, Mike Rogers for the National Security Agency, he found fault with the findings. Effectively, it was Clapper and Brennan. But what I did find interesting was that the IG noted that it was McCabe and Comey who were really pushing to include the Steele dossier in the intelligence community assessment. Now, we need to take that with a big grain of salt, because Horowitz is not able to go look at what Brennan's role was with the CIA. And it was indeed John Brennan who was force-feeding information into the FBI starting in early 2016. And he did this repeatedly. He's testified to that he gave every bit of information that he came across, some of which may not have been so legal. It appears to be a use of reverse targeting. But regardless, information that he came across on the Trump campaign, he gave every bit of that to the FBI starting in the spring of 2016. And if you think about that from the FBI's role, well, at some point you almost have to open an investigation. You don't want to be the person from the FBI, be it Comey, McCabe, whoever, that's got to go before the Senate and explain why you ignored information that the CIA director had been giving you over a period of a number of months. So in my mind, at some point, the FBI literally had no choice. They had to open some sort of an investigation. Now, I don't know that it needed to be a formal counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign, but they did have to do something. You just don't want to be the person explaining that you completely ignored repeated information from the CIA director, John Brennan.
So, Jeff, what were the recommendations of the report ultimately?
Well, there was a large number of recommendations that were made by the report, but what was particularly interesting is that the Inspector General wasn't leaving any of these recommendations just up to the FBI.
Okay.
What he noted was that he was initiating effectively a whole nother review that was going to emanate out of the Office of Inspector General, that was going to be looking at all the compliance issues and the people involved from top to bottom in both the Woods procedures and the FISA application process, and announced that literally today we are opening a brand new audit into this process. So what the IG is saying is, rather than kind of giving the FBI a list of recommendations of here are errors that we found and here are errors that we think you should address, the IG is telling the FBI, we don't trust you to make these. We're going to be the ones that are going to oversee all the different alterations and changes that you're making. And oh, by the way, if we don't like them, we're going to note them. We're looking at the devil's in the details. We're going to make sure that not only do you comply with us, with our recommendations, but that we agree with the way in which that you're complying with our recommendations. And I found that to be a fairly unusual part. In addition, people you often see this narrative that the only person who's being referred is the attorney Kevin Kleinsmith, who altered that one email. Right. And again, it was a very, very critical alteration. Yeah. But that's not the case. Horowitz was referring everybody in his report to the FBI and to the Department of Justice, which again, remind everybody, that's headed up by Barr, who has appointed John Durham to be looking at this entire process.
So I just pulled up the line from Horowitz's testimony that attests to this, and it's quite remarkable.
FBI managers, supervisors, and senior officials displayed a lack of understanding or awareness of important information concerning many of the problems that we identified. That is why, as you will see in the report, our final recommendation was to refer the entire chain of command that we outline here to the FBI and the department for consideration of how to assess and address their performance failures.
You know what, it just struck me as I was reading this that, there's been a lot of trust lost in our FBI, but actually implementation of this kind of thing and with the type of oversight that Horowitz has been talking about could help fix that. What do you think? Is that?
I hope so. I think it's going to be a long time coming. I think it's going to be a lengthy process. You don't get to this point. Trust isn't rebuilt in a day. The proof is sort of in the pudding. But I found that statement to be sweeping, but also very, very powerful. And note that Horowitz was not saying that he was making the referrals only to the FBI, but also to the department, which is another way of saying he's making those recommendations to Attorney General William Barr. So this goes far beyond just sort of admonishing the FBI with a little slap on the wrist and saying, here's our list of things we want you to fix. This is a referral for continued investigation and implementation of reform. So it will be very, very interesting to see what Durham comes out with his report. Unfortunately, I do think we're going to have to wait some time for that to make its way out into the public.
So, any final words before we finish up?
I still personally have a lot more work to do on the IG report. It's every time I go through it, I find something new. I've been trying to compile a list of identifying all the people that are involved from the acronyms, such as SSA1.
Right.
I'm highly confident I know who that individual is. But at any rate, I've been trying to figure out who the various parties are. I've probably got about 50% of that work done. I'm still reading through parts of the report, and when I reread portions, oftentimes based on other information I found in the IG report, it provides new light.
Okay.
And I guess the other thing that I would tell people is that if you're reading the IG report, pay particularly close attention to the footnotes. Almost invariably, some of the best information is to be found in the footnotes of the IG report. And this was precisely true for the June 2018 IG report as well. But, I guess I'll end by saying I think there's a lot more information to come out just from the report itself, simply based on the size of the document.
Well, we'll be looking forward to reading all of your columns that will be coming out, no doubt.
Well, thank you very much.
Over the coming weeks. And such a pleasure to have you.
I'm very glad to be on. It was great. Thank you very much for having me on. Appreciate it.